problem with that, but it has to be early. It can't be after the time is due. So please plan accordingly, and I will open it up for you. You don't have to come here. I'll trust you that you'll not cheat or anything on that. So, okay, so the final. Make sure you know the CIA triad. And make sure that you what I've tried to do is ask some questions of giving you an example and having you say, okay, which part of the triad does this relate to? Confidentiality, integrity, or availability. So make sure that you're familiar with that. Know the difference between black hats and white hats, and what each of them do. Let's see. Understand the types of security controls that we have. Not only do we have technical controls, but we have to look at people and processes. So people, processes, and technologies, recognize that all of those things work together, and be able to identify, if we see a control, what types of controls would they be. Let's see, there's more CIA stuff. Okay, know what a DR plan is, disaster recovery plan. Let's see. Okay, so there's going to be a chart early in the chapters that talks about types of controls, and like high risk, low risk, medium risk, and then extreme risk. And it's going to talk about different types of controls that can be put in place in there, like they have to be done right away, or maybe routine procedures can be used for those. Find that chart, make sure that you're familiar with that, so that you can say, okay, if it's a low risk, I know it can be taken care of by like routine procedures or something like that. If it's an extreme risk, it has to be kind of a drop everything, and we need to focus on those things right away. Yep.
Did you say what chapter that was in?
And it's earlier in the book. I don't have the chapters listed on here, I'm sorry, but it's in some of the earlier chapters of the book. Okay, so make sure that you can understand the difference between preventative, detective, and corrective controls. We've seen a little bit about deterrent controls. I think there's any questions on that. If there is, I'll point it out. But definitely know preventative, detective, and corrective. Make sure that you can, again, use examples of those. Let's see. Oh, understand what defense in depth is. So we talked a little bit about our layers of controls that we have in there. Remember that we had the two types of security requirements. So we had to make sure that they were functioning the way they were, and that we had the assurance around those, so to make sure that you understand those. Remember that controls don't ever eliminate risk. We just mitigate our risk. We talked about defense in depth. There's another question on that. Make sure you understand the concept of the principle of least privilege. Know the difference between a threat, a risk, and a vulnerability. There's another question from that chart of which the low, medium, high, critical, and how quickly you need to respond to those risks. Know the difference between procedures and policies. Remember, procedures are kind of the step-by-step versus policies versus guidelines. So make sure you understand the difference between those. Know who computer security is the responsibility of within an organization.
Can you say that one more time?
Knowing who within an organization is responsible for security. Understand what separation of duties is. difference between a system-specific and an issue-specific policy. And some examples.
System-specific and
Issue-specific. Know what HIPAA is? PCI and Sarbanes-Oxley. Another one that understanding what a detective control is. Know what the rings of trust are? Know the differences between primary and secondary storage. Know the difference between a business continuity plan versus a DR plan. Know the difference between cold, warm, and hot sites.
say that again?
Cold, warm, and hot sites. Remember what some of the tests are in DR. Like you have the full interruption, you have the walkthroughs, you have the simulations. Know what those are. Checklist, the other one. Bunch of questions on those, probably half a dozen on those types of tests. When you are doing your business continuity plan, know what the annualized loss expectancy is. So when you're doing your risk assessment for that.
Say that.
The annualized loss expectancy. There's a couple of questions. So when you look at some of the, there was a chapter in there where we're talking about some of the domains of the CBK. So it would give you an examples of saying something like disaster recovery plan is under this particular section of the CBK. So make sure you're familiar with the names of those 10 common bodies of knowledge.
You said CBK?
CBK, common body of knowledge. Those are the 10 things that the book
Yeah.
went through. Okay, so now we're going to go into some physical security areas. So make sure that you understand examples of physical security. Know what man traps are, turnstiles, security fencing. They also talk in there they'll segregate them between administrative, physical, environmental, life safety in that chapter. Make sure that you understand the differences between those. So there's a bunch of them between, is it a technical control, is it an administrative control, is it a physical control, is it an environmental life safety control? So know some examples of those. More questions on making sure that you understand around preventative versus detective, where kind of the purposes behind those. So for example, preventative controls, you want to reduce the frequency and the impact of those controls. So there's some parts that talk about those. Know the different methods for sanitizing data off of drives. So understanding what degaussing is, destruction of those, overwriting of data. Another question on hot, cold, and warm sites. We talked about, know what trusted recovery controls are. So remember that, it's whether it's, what happens when it crashes, does it fail open, closed? let's see. Know what media viability is? Okay, so then we're going to get into multi-factor and authentication. So there's going to be questions that say, if you remember we talked about, is this multi-factor or is this single factor twice? So make sure that you can distinguish those and the examples of those. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you just keep going on those same different types of questions. Let's see. It'll say a question like, give me which one of these is something you know or something that you are. And it'll have 4 choices and you pick which one of those relates to those. That question. Know the difference between discretionary access and mandatory access controls.
Can you repeat that one again, sorry?
Discretionary access versus mandatory access controls. Know what role-based access controls are.
I'm sorry, say that again?
Role-based access. Know what a radius server is. That's for remote connection. Know what Kerberos is. How do you spell that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Kerberos.
There, I wasn't close.
Okay, public-private key. Make sure that you can distinguish between what's public key versus private key, how many keys they use, which one's symmetric and asymmetric, the difference between hashing versus encryption. Okay, and then there's going to be questions about Bob and Alice. So it may say something like, Bob sends Alice a message. Bob used Alice's key to encrypt it. What does Alice use to decrypt it? Okay. Understand the difference between digital signatures and digital envelopes. So one of them is going to prove where it came from. The other one's going to prove it wasn't tampered with along the process. Know what a VPN is? DMZ. IDS and IPS. And know the different types of faults. You have false positive and false negatives. Be able to define those with the IPS system. There's also going to be a list in there that talks about public information versus corporate information versus PII. Look at that chart and know those examples. There's a picture that's a security umbrella in the book. Be familiar with that. Understand the difference between a simple packet capture versus a stateful firewall. Yep, a simple packet capture versus a stateful firewall. Stateful. The chart that I showed you today around the different phases of the SDLC and what types of testing is done during those phases. Be familiar with that. Be real familiar with that. Know what credit card fraud is and identity theft. That's it. So it follows the book for the most part. There's a few like in the middle that are a little out of order, but for the most part it follows the chapters in the book. That's all she wrote. Any questions about those? Any areas you're not sure about? Yes, they're all multiple choice. Yep, there actually is one true/false question in there. I forgot about that when I noticed that. I was like, oh, I forgot that was there. Yes.
Sorry, I wasn't sure if I understood. So do you want us to come to class next Thursday or take it? Okay.
Yeah, come to class. If you have some extenuating, and the reason for that is, if you have questions during the exam, I'd rather you just be able to come up and ask me there, and we can resolve it right away. But if you have extenuating circumstances, like I said, you can take it any time before it's offered. So just let me know.
And how long do you think it'll take? General?
Yeah, last semester, I think the longest person took about an hour and 45 minutes. But I've got 3 hours allocated for the exam. So you've got the whole class. You can go, we'll go from 6 to 9. And I'll be here to answer questions. So, once we started, if you have a question, just come up here and quietly ask. And if you bring up something and I look at it, I'm like, oh, I missed that. I have 2 right answers in there or something, I can just let everyone know and get it done right there, then and there. Like I said with the studying, start with the slides. I've made sure that all the answers are in the slides. If you read the slides and you need more clarification, go to the book. But I would make your slides the primary source of your study. Okay, anything else? If you're studying in the week and you have questions, text me. That's the best way to get a hold of me quickly. I am actually going to be in California Monday and Tuesday, so I may be a little harder. I'm going to a 49ers game, I think. So, should be fun. That's what I think. That's the team. Yeah, I'm a big fan. I'm gonna hang out at the bar. They can watch the game. I'm in the back. Okay, anything else? All right, we're done for the night. So.